The cantina on Proxima Station hummed, with the usual mix of voices from a dozen different worlds, blue-kinned. Dendorians argued over cargo prices, while reptilian Vorthon merchants counted their earnings. The air smelled of exotic spices and engine fuel, combination that made most beings either hungry or sick. In the darkest corner of the room sat Commander Zixthak. His massive frame took up most of the booth, all forearms resting on the metal table. Deep scars ran across his gray, shell-like skin, each one telling a story of battles fought across the galaxy. His compound eyes reflected the dim light as he stared into his drink. The young cadets had been watching him for an hour. They whispered among themselves, pointing at the famous commander who had fought in more wars than most species had even heard of. Finally, one of them got brave enough to approach Commander Zixth. The voice belonged to a young Cathari female, her green scales still bright with youth. We heard you fought in the Terror campaign. Is that true? Zixthak looked up slowly, his 4 eyes focused on the small group of cadets standing nervously near his table. They were so young, so eager, just like he had been once before he learned what real war looked like. Sit down, he said in his deep, rumbling voice, but only if you want to hear the truth. Most beings prefer the lies they tell in the militarities. The cadets quickly slid into the booth. Across from him, there were 5 of them, 2 Cathari, 1 Voron, 1 Centurion, and something that looked like a walking tree branch that Zix could not identify. All wore the fresh uniforms of junior officers. The Terra campaign, Zix repeated, rolling the words around like they tasted bitter. You think you know about it from your history books, the great victory of the galactic hegemony over the upstart human race, clean, simple, over in 6 months. He took a long drink from his glass. Fermented kelp wine burned going down, but it helped with the memories. The books are wrong, he continued. We did win technically, but victory and survival are not the same thing. Half the beings who fought in that campaign never came home. The other half came back changed. I was one of the lucky ones. The tree-like cadet leaned forward, its voice sounding like wind through leaves. But humans were a primitive species. They had barely left their home system. How could they pose any real threat? Zixthak's laugh had no humor in it. That's exactly what we thought. Admiral Klexron himself said it would be a training exercise for the new recruits. 6 billion humans spread across 12 worlds, armed with chemical rockets and metal bullets. What could they possibly do against the greatest military force in the galaxy? He sat down his drink and looked directly at each cadet. Let me tell you about the first human I met. His name was Jake Murphy, 22 years old by their calendar, barely old enough to be considered an adult by their own standards. The cantina seemed to grow quieter as other patrons stopped their conversations to listen. Word had spread that the old commander was telling war stories, and everyone wanted to hear. We landed on Kepler 442 b 3 days after the war began. Zixthak continued. It was supposed to be a mining colony, 5,000 humans, mostly families. Our intelligence said they had no military presence, no weapons heavier than construction equipment, an easy target to demonstrate hegemony power. His 4 hands clenched into fists as the memories came flooding back. I led the 3rd assault wave, 300 elite shock troops the best the hegemony had to offer. We expected to find cowering civilians begging for mercy. Instead, we found Jake Murphy, the Voran cadet, hissed softly, one human against 300 of your troops. One human, Zigzag confirmed, standing in the middle of the colony's main street holding an ancient projectile weapon, some kind of rifle that his grandfather had used in their primitive wars. When he saw us coming, he didn't run, he didn't hide, he raised that old gun and started shooting. Sixth paused to take another drink. The young officers waited in complete silence. Our armor could stop his bullets easily. They bounced off like raindrops, but Jake Murphy kept firing anyway. When his weapon ran empty, he reloaded. When we got closer, he grabbed another gun from somewhere, always firing, always fighting, never backing down. That makes no sense, the Centurion cadet said. If his weapons could not hurt you, why continue fighting? Zigzag smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. Because he wasn't trying to kill us, he was buying time. Every second he kept us focused on him was another second for the civilians to escape through the mines. Jake Murphy knew he was going to die. He accepted it, but he was going to make his death count for something. Commander's voice grew softer, more thoughtful. We finally brought him down with a stun weapon. Couldn't kill him outright. We needed prisoners for interrogation. When he woke up in our detention cell, the first thing he asked was whether the families had gotten away safely. One of the Cathari cadets shifted uncomfortably. Did they escape? All of them, Zigzag replied. Every single civilian made to the emergency bunkers. Jake Murphy, alone and outgunned, had delayed an entire battalion long enough to save 5,000 lives. The cantina had grown completely quiet now. Even the Andorian traders had stopped there, arguing to listen. That should have been our first warning, Zix continued, but we were arrogant. We assumed Murphy was an exception, some kind of genetic defect that made him suicidally brave. We had no idea that we had just met the most normal human in the galaxy. He finished his drink and signaled for another. The serving droid, a simple mechanical unit, quickly brought a fresh glass. The real shock came during Murphy's interrogation. Our best mind readers, beings who could crack the thoughts of any species in the galaxy, could barely touch his consciousness. Not because he was especially strong-willed, but because human minds are different, chaotic, unpredictable. Zigzag's compound eyes seemed to look through the cadets, seeing something far away. When they finally broke through his mental defenses, they found something that terrified them. Jake Murphy wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing, not failing to win the war. He knew that was impossible. Failing to protect the people he cared about. The tree cadet made a sound like branches scraping together. You speak of him with respect, but he was your enemy. He was, Zigzag agreed, and that's what made it so unsettling. In every other war we had fought, enemies hated each other. Fear and hatred make beings predictable, but Jake Murphy didn't hate us. He saw us as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome. Nothing personal. The commander leaned back in his seat, his forearms spreading wide. During his questioning, they asked him what he thought would happen to him. Jake said he figured we would probably execute him, which was fine as long as it was quick. Then he asked if we needed any information about human defensive positions. The cadets looked confused. Centurion spoke first. He offered to betray his own species. No, Zixek said with something that might have been admiration. He offered to lie. To us, Jake Murphy spent 6 hours giving our intelligence officers completely false information about human military capabilities, made up stories about secret weapons, hidden bases, alliance with other species, all lies but told so convincingly that our command staff wasted weeks chasing phantoms. Zigzag raised his fresh drink in a mock salute. And he did it all while smiling. Actually smiling like it was some kind of game. The serving droid returned with a tray of drinks for the cadets who had been too absorbed in the story to order anything. They accepted them absently, still focused on the commander's words. That was when I realized we weren't fighting a military force, Zix said. Quietly, we were fighting something much more dangerous. We were fighting an idea. The idea that some things are worth dying for, and once an idea like that takes hold in a species' mind, you can't defeat it with superior firepower. He looked directly at each young officer in turn. Jake Murphy escaped 2 days later, broke out of a maximum security detention facility using nothing but patience and a piece of metal he had somehow kept hidden. Guards found his cell empty except for a note that said, "Thanks for the intel, we never recaptured him." The cantina slowly returned to its normal noise level as conversations resumed, but the cadets remained silent, processing what they had heard. What happened to him? The green-scaled Cathari finally asked. Sixth's expression grew even more serious. Jake Murphy became a legend among his people. Every human soldier knew his story, and every one of them decided they wanted to be just like him. He stood up slowly, his massive frame towering over the table. That young officers was just the beginning. The real war hadn't even started yet. Sixth sat back down heavily, his forearms reaching for the fresh drink. The young cadets leaned forward eagerly, hungry for more of his story. Around them, the cantina continued its usual business, but several other patrons had moved closer to listen. After the Jake Murphy incident, our command decided to take the humans more seriously. Zix began. Not much more seriously, mind you. They still thought one human holding off a battalion was just luck, so they sent me to Newer. He took a long sip of his kelp wine before continuing. Newer was different from the mining colony. It was a military outpost built into an asteroid in the outer system. 12,000 human soldiers and their families lived there. Our scouts reported heavy defenses, automated weapons, the works. The Vorthan cadet hissed quietly. Surely that was more of a challenge than one human with an old rifle. Zix's compound eyes glittered with dark humor. You would think so, Admiral Klexrin. Certainly thought so. He assigned 3 full battle groups to take the station. 15,000 elite troops supported by orbital bombardment platforms and assault carriers. The commander paused, rolling his glass between his hands. The plan was simple: surround the asteroid, demand surrender, and if they refused, blast them into space dust. Clean and efficient. What could go wrong? He looked up at the eager faces of the cadets. What went wrong was Staff Sergeant Lisa Grant, the tree-like cadet, rustled its branches. Another exceptional human. That's what we thought at first, Zigzag replied. Grant was 34 years old, had 2 children back on Earth, and commanded a squad of 12 soldiers, just 12, when our battle group surrounded Newer. She was assigned to defend Section 7, a maintenance area that controlled the station's power grid. Zix's voice grew more serious by all military logic. Section 7 was indefensible. It was on the outer edge of the station, exposed to space on three sides. No heavy weapons, no reinforced barriers, nothing but some storage rooms and a few corridors. Any competent officer would have evacuated the area and fallen back to stronger positions. He took another drink. Lisa Grant was not any competent officer. She was human. The cantina had grown quiet again. Even the Andorian traders had stopped their negotiations to listen when the bombardment began. Grant's squad was the first to come under attack. My battalion was tasked with breaking through Section 7 and securing the power grid. 300 of the hegemony's finest assault troops against 12 humans in an impossible position. Zix's four hands clenched into fists. The first thing that went wrong was the asteroid itself. New series had low gravity, maybe 1/10 of standard. Our troops were trained for normal gravity combat. The humans had lived there for years. They knew how to use the environment. One of the Cathari cadets leaned forward. Environmental advantage, that makes tactical sense. It would. Zixek agreed, if that was all they did. But Grant's squad did things that made no tactical sense at all. They welded shut every blast door behind them as they fell back. Not to slow us down. We could blast through the doors easily. They did it to control our movement, to make us go exactly where they wanted us to go. The commander's voice grew more animated as he remembered the battle. Every corridor became a trap. They had rigged the ventilation systems to spray industrial chemicals that ate through our armor, used the low gravity to bounce explosive charges off walls and ceilings, turned the maintenance tunnels into sniper positions. He shook his head in what might have been admiration. But the worst part was the psychological warfare. Grant's people had somehow tapped into our communication frequencies. Every time we advanced, we heard human voices singing their battle songs, laughing, making jokes about our tactics. The Centurion cadet looked confused. They were laughing while fighting for their lives constantly. Zixek confirmed. I heard Grant herself over the calming out encouragement to her troops while plasma fire filled the corridors around her. Nice shot, Pete. Hey, Maria, bet you can't hit that big ugly one in the middle like it was some kind of sport. Zix paused to let that sink in. For 18 standard hours, 12 humans held off 300 of our best troops. Not just held us off, they made us look like fools. Every time we thought we had them cornered, they would disappear through some maintenance shaft we didn't know existed. Every time we regrouped, another one of our soldiers would step on a booby trap. The serving droid brought another round of drinks. Cadets accepted them absently, too absorbed in the story to notice. Breakthrough came when we finally brought up heavy assault mechs, 12 FT. Tall walking weapons platforms armed with enough firepower to level a city block. Surely that would end the human resistance. Zixthax's laugh had no humor in it. Grant's response was to collapse an entire section of the station on top of them. Used the industrial mining charges stored in Section 7 to bring down 250,000 tons of metal and rock. Buried 6 assault mechs in half my battalion under the debris. He took a drink, his compound eyes distant with memory. That's when I realized we weren't just fighting soldiers, we were fighting engineers who happened to carry guns. Every piece of equipment in that station became a weapon in their hands. They turned the gravity generators into projectile launchers, used the water recycling system to flood corridors with superheated steam, made the emergency lighting system strobe at frequencies that disrupted our optical sensors. The tree cut it, made a scraping branch sound. How did it end? Zigzag was quiet. For a long moment, we finally cornered them in the main power control room. Grant and 3 of her soldiers, surrounded by the wreckage of their defenses. They had fought for 18 hours straight, without relief, without resupply, without hope of reinforcement. His voice grew softer. When we broke down the final door, Grant was still at her post, still firing. One arm hung useless at her side. Her armor was cracked and bleeding, and she had shrapnel embedded in her chest, but her rifle was steady and her aim was true. Zigzag looked directly at each cadet. She could have surrendered, should have surrendered. Her mission was complete. She had delayed us long enough for the rest of the station to evacuate the civilian population. But she kept firing until her weapon ran empty. The cantina was completely silent now. When we finally stunned her unconscious, she had a grenade in her free hand, thumb on the trigger. If we had tried to execute her squad, she would have taken us all with her. One of the Cathari cadets whispered, "What did she say when she woke up?" Zigzag smiled grimly. First thing she asked was whether her kids were proud of her. The second thing she said was, "Tell your friends this was just the warm-up." He finished his drink in one gulp. Later, during interrogation, we learned that Grant's 12-person squad had never been intended to hold Section 7. Their orders were to delay us for 2 hours at most, then fall back to the main defensive line. Grant decided on her own to hold the position for as long as possible. The commander stood up, towering over the table. 2 hours became 18 hours, 12 humans against 300 elite troops in an impossible position with no support and no hope of victory. And they held the line because their sergeant decided it was the right thing to do. 6 looked down at the young officers. After Newer, our command finally understood what they were dealing with. Humans didn't fight like any other species we had encountered. They didn't calculate odds or weigh cost. They simply decided what needed to be done and did it regardless of whether it was possible. He turned to leave, then paused. Lisa Grant spent 6 months in our prisoner camps. When the war ended, she was among the first humans we released. Do you know what she did? The cadets shook their heads. She requested permission to visit the graves of the hegemony soldiers who died at Newer. Said she wanted to pay her respects to brave warriors who were just following orders. Zigzag's expression grew thoughtful. That's when I began to understand that we hadn't just underestimated human military capability, we had completely misunderstood human nature itself. With that, he walked away, leaving the young cadets to contemplate the implications of what they had heard. Next evening, the cadets returned to the same cantina. Word had spread through Proxima Station about Commander Zix's war stories, and tonight the place was packed. Beings from a dozen different worlds had come to hear the legendary veteran speak about the terror campaign. Zigzag sat in his usual corner booth, But tonight he was not alone. Several other hegemony veterans had joined him, their scarred forms bearing witness to battles fought across the galaxy. When the young cadets approached, the old commander gestured for them to sit. "You came back," he observed, his compound eyes studying their eager faces. "I suppose you want to hear more about human warfare." The green-cowled Cathari nodded quickly. "Please, Commander, the other instructors at the academy say your stories cannot be true. They say no species could fight the way you describe." One of the other veterans, a massive creature with 6 legs and armor plating for skin, made a sound like grinding metal. "Tell them about Titan Base, Zixth. Tell them about Colonel Brooks." Zixth's forearms tensed at the mention of that name. Around the cantina, conversations died as beings realized another story was beginning. "Titan Base," he repeated slowly. "Yes, that was where we learned that humans do not just break military rules. They rewrite them completely." He signaled for drinks, and the serving droid quickly brought a tray for the table. By the time we reached Titan, the war had been going on for 4 months. We had learned to respect human tactical abilities, but we still believed that superior numbers and firepower would eventually win. Titan Base was our chance to prove it. Zixthak took a drink before continuing. The base was built inside Saturn's largest moon, carved out of solid rock and ice. 5,000 human soldiers and support staff, commanded by Colonel Amy Brooks. Our intelligence said she was 42 years old, had been fighting in human wars for 20 years, and was considered one of their best defensive specialists. The tree-like cadet rustled its branches. A defensive position inside a moon sounds formidable. It was, Zixth agreed. Multiple levels, reinforced corridors, independent life support systems. The humans had spent 3 years turning that moon into the most fortified position in their outer system. The 6-legged veteran made his grinding sound again. "Tell them about the siege." Sixth nodded grimly. "We surrounded Titan with 50 battle cruisers and 200,000 ground troops. No supplies could get in. No communications could get out. By all military doctrine, the base should have surrendered within days." He paused, looking around at the packed cantina. Colonel Brooks had other ideas. The commander's voice grew more intense as he remembered the battle. "The first surprise came on day 3 of the siege. We were monitoring their power levels, expecting them to start rationing energy as their reserves ran low. Instead, their energy output increased. One of the Cathari cadets looked confused. "How is that possible during a siege?" Brooks had ordered her engineers to cannibalize every piece of non-essential equipment in the base. Zixthak explained. "Food, processors, recreational systems, even medical equipment. They stripped out the power cells and wiring to build improvised weapons." The massive alien veteran leaned forward. "Show them the scar." Zigzag. Reluctantly, Zixth rolled up one of his sleeves, revealing a jagged mark that ran the length of his arm. Magnetic rail gun built from a food delivery system. Brooks' people turned their cafeteria into an artillery position. He covered the scar and continued his story, but that was just the beginning. On day 5 they started their chemical attacks, used the base's air recycling system to pump toxic gases into our landing zones. The gases were made from cleaning supplies and industrial solvents. The Centurion cadet Looked sick, they poisoned their own air system, only the outer sections, Zix replied. Brooks had sealed her people into the inner levels and was using the outer base as a weapon against us. Every corridor we captured became a death trap. The cantina had grown completely quiet. Even the Andorian traders had stopped their arguments to listen. On day 7, they hit us with something we had never seen before. Lieutenant Dan Foster led a team through the base's waste disposal system to plant explosives directly under our command post. Zix's compound eyes seemed to look through the assembled crowd, seeing something far away. Foster and his team crawled through sewage pipes for 6 hours to reach our position. When the bombs went off, we lost our entire command structure in one attack. 30 senior officers killed instantly. The six-legged veteran made his grinding sound. Tell them about the reactor. Zikthak was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Day 12. We had been besieging the base for nearly 2 weeks. Our troops were exhausted, our equipment was failing, and we had suffered casualties that would have broken any other military force. But we were winning. Brooks' people were down to their last reserves of food and ammunition. He took a drink, his 4 hands shaking slightly. That's when she activated Protocol 7. The young cadets leaned forward, sensing something important. Protocol 7 was something they humans called a dead man switch. Brooks had rigged the base's nuclear reactor to explode if certain conditions were met. She sent us one message: if you want this base, you can have what's left of it. The tree cadet made a sound like wind through dead leaves. She was willing to destroy her own base. More than that, Zixthak replied. The explosion would have taken out half our fleet and killed 200,000 hegemony soldiers. Brooks was holding the trigger for a weapon that would end the sea permanently. One of the Cathari cadets whispered, "What did you do?" We tried to call her bluff. The six-legged veteran answered, "We thought no rational being would actually detonate such a weapon." Zixthak nodded grimly. "We were thinking like rational beings." Brooks was thinking like a human. The commander stood up and began pacing behind the table. For 6 days she held that trigger. 6 days of negotiations, threats, and attempts to breach the inner levels. Every hour we expected her to either surrender or detonate the reactor. She didn't either. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the cadets. Instead, she used those 6 days to evacuate all the wounded prisoners from both sides, every injured hegemony soldier who had been captured, every human who was too hurt to fight. She loaded them onto escape pods and launched them toward our fleet. The cantina was so quiet that the hum of the air recycling system seemed loud. On the 6th day, Brooks sent her final message. She said she was tired of holding the trigger and it was time to end the siege. We prepared for the explosion that would kill us all. Zix sat back down heavily. The explosion never came. Instead, Brooks opened the inner blast doors and walked out with her hands raised. She surrendered herself and her remaining troops, but only after she had saved every life she could save. The young officer sat in stunned silence. We asked her later why she didn't detonate the reactor. The six-legged veteran said her answer was simple: because you would have learned nothing from dying, and my people would have learned nothing from killing you. Zigzag finished his drink and signaled. For another, that was when I realized that human warfare is not about destroying enemies, it is about protecting something they consider more important than victory. Brooks could have won the siege by killing everyone, including herself. Instead, she chose to lose in a way that saved as many lives as possible. He looked around at the packed cantina. After Titan Base, our entire understanding of human military doctrine changed. We had been fighting an enemy who was willing to die for victory. We discovered we were actually fighting an enemy who was willing to lose for honor. The serving droid brought fresh drinks, but none of the cadets touched theirs. What happened to Colonel Brooks? The Centurion finally asked. Zigzag's expression softened slightly. She spent the rest of the war in our detention facilities, treated our guards with respect, shared her rations with other prisoners, and never stopped trying to improve conditions for everyone. He paused, then added, when the war ended, Brooks was offered command of the new Joint Human Hegemony Defense Force. She accepted on the condition that former enemies would serve together as equals. The massive veteran made his grinding sound one more time. She saved my life during the Zapirian plague outbreak. A human colonel who had once been willing to kill me to protect her people later risked her own life to save mine. Zigzag stood up again, towering over the table. That is the most dangerous thing about human warfare. They can fight you like demons, but they never stop seeing you as a person worth saving, even when you are trying to kill them. He looked down at the young cadets. Remember this. When you face humans in battle, they are not fighting because they hate you. They are fighting because they love something more than they fear death, and that makes them the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy. With that, Zigzag walked away, leaving the cadets to contemplate the complexity of human nature and the true meaning of honorable warfare. On the third night, the cantina was standing room only. Word had spread throughout the station about Commander Zix's stories, and beings had traveled from other systems just to hear about the Terra campaign. The old commander sat at his usual table, surrounded by fellow veterans and eager listeners. The young cadets had arrived early to secure their seats. They watched as Zigzag slowly finished his drink, his forearms moving with the deliberate care of someone carrying heavy memories. Tonight, he began, his deep voice cutting through the crowd noise. I will tell you about the Battle of Wolf 359. The day we learned that humans do not just think outside military doctrine. They think outside logic itself. A hush fell over the packed cantina. Even the serving droid seemed to move more quietly. By month 5 of the war, we thought we understood human capabilities. Zix continued. We had adapted our tactics, increased our forces, and prepared for their unconventional strategies. Admiral Klexron himself declared that the humans had shown us their best tricks. The six-legged veteran from the previous night made his grinding sound tell them about Admiral Sullivan. Zigzag nodded grimly. Admiral Kate Sullivan commanded the human fleet at Wolf 359. 43 years old, mother of 2 children, veteran of their internal wars. Our intelligence file said she was competent but not exceptional. He paused to accept a fresh drink from the serving droid. What our intelligence files did not mention was that Sullivan had once been a circus performer before joining. They're military, she understood something about impossible moves that are tactical. Computers could never calculate. The tree-like cadet rustled its branches. A circus performer became an admiral. Humans promote based on ability, not birth, Zigzag explained. Sullivan had proven herself in a dozen smaller battles, but Wolf 359 was different. She commanded 37 human ships against our grand fleet of 370 vessels. The massive alien veteran leaned forward, 10-1. Odds should have been a simple victory. 6 compound eyes glittered with dark memory should have been, we had planned the battle for weeks. Computer simulations showed human defeat in every scenario. Our admirals were already discussing how to divide the captured ships. He took a long drink before continuing. The battle began exactly as predicted. Sullivan's fleet moved into defensive positions around Wolf 359's asteroid belt. Standard tactics, nothing unexpected. Our first wave engaged her outer pickets while our main force moved to surround them. The cantina was completely silent now, hundreds of beings hanging on every word. Then Sullivan did something that broke every rule of space combat. She split her fleet. One of the Cathari cadets looked confused. Split her fleet? That makes no tactical sense. Exactly, Zigzag replied. She divided her already outnumbered ships into 7 separate groups, each moving in different directions. Our tactical computers could not understand the pattern. It looked like random panic. The commander stood up and began pacing, his forearms gesturing as he described the battle. Our admirals were delighted. Divided forces are easier to destroy. We began hunting down each group separately, confident that we would eliminate them one by one. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the cadets. What we did not realize was that Sullivan was not trying to win a space battle. She was conducting a performance. Every movement of her ships was designed to make us react in specific ways. The 6-legged veteran made his grinding sound. Show them the tactical display. Zigzag pulled out a small device and activated a holographic projector. The air above their table filled with tiny points of light showing the positions of ships during the battle. Here, he said, pointing to the display. 7 human groups apparently fleeing in random directions, our fleet pursuing them, spreading out to cover more territory. The lights began moving, showing the progression of the battle. What we could not see was the bigger picture. While we chased her scattered groups, Sullivan was herding us into a specific formation, like a circus trainer guiding animals through tricks. The hologram showed the alien fleet slowly forming a loose ring around the system. On day 2 of the battle, we had destroyed half her ships and captured most of the asteroid belt. Victory seemed certain. That was when Commander Pete Johnson made his attack run. Zigzag highlighted one small light moving toward the center of the alien formation. Johnson commanded a human destroyer, one of their smallest warships. His orders were to ram the flagship of our second battle group at maximum speed. Centurion cadet gasped, a suicide attack. That is what we thought, Zix replied. Johnson's ship accelerated directly toward Admiral Vexar's dreadnought. No evasive maneuvers, no weapons fired, just a straight collision course. The hologram showed the tiny light moving steadily toward a much larger vessel. Our point defense systems should have destroyed Johnson's ship long before impact, but Sullivan had timed the attack perfectly. Johnson's approach brought him through the debris field of a previously destroyed human cruiser. Zigzag manipulated the display to show the details. The debris masked Johnson's ship from our sensors until the last moment. By the time we detected him, it was too late to stop the collision. The small light merged with the large one and both disappeared from the display. Johnson's destroyer punched hole completely through Admiral Vexar's flagship. Both ships were destroyed instantly, along with 1,500 crew members. From both sides, the cantina was deadly quiet. Several beings had stopped drinking to stare at the holographic display. That should have been the end of it. Zix continued, a brave but pointless sacrifice, except that Johnson's attack had created something that should not have been militarily significant. He zoomed in on the gap in the alien formation, a hold in our defensive line, one small gap where two ships used to be. Any competent admiral would have moved other vessels to fill the opening within minutes. The tree cadet made its wind through leaves sound, but something prevented that. Sergeant Mary Bell, Zigzag replied. Simply, the hologram shifted to show small dots moving through the gap while we were dealing with the collision. Bell led a boarding party of 20 human Marines through the hole in our formation. They used Johnson's sacrifice as cover to approach our command ship. Zig's forehands clenched into fists as he remembered Bell's team had launched from one of Sullivan's scattered groups. Just before Johnson's attack, they flew through the debris field in powered armor, using the explosion as camouflage. The display showed tiny figures moving through space toward the largest alien vessel. By the time we realized what was happening, Bell and her Marines were already inside our flagship. They had cut through the hull using industrial tools and were fighting their way toward the bridge. One of the Cathari cadets leaned forward. 20 Marines against a crew of thousands. 20 Marines who knew exactly where they were going. Zigzag corrected. Sullivan had given them complete blueprints of our ship design. The humans had been studying our technology for months. Holograms zoomed in to show the interior of the alien ship. Bell's team moved through the ventilation systems, avoiding the main corridors where our security forces were concentrated. They used human-sized passages that our larger troops could not follow. Sixth voice grew more intense. In 37 minutes, Bell fought her way from the outer hull to the main bridge. She lost half her team in the process, but she reached her target. The commander paused, his compound eyes reflecting the holographic light. When Bell burst onto the bridge, she was carrying something our sensors had not detected, a device that humans called a grenade, a primitive explosive that would kill everyone in the room. The cantina seemed to hold its breath. Bell could have detonated the device immediately, could have killed our entire command staff and herself in one final act of defiance. Instead, she made Admiral Klexron an offer. Zigzag turned off the holographic display and sat back down. She wanted our tactical frequencies and fleet positions. In exchange, she would set the explosive for a delayed detonation, giving everyone time to evacuate the bridge. The six-legged veteran made his grinding sound. Klexron should have refused, should have called her bluff. He tried. Zigzag replied. Bell's response was to pull the pin from her grenade and start counting down. 10 seconds to decide. Admiral, your choice. The young cadet sat in stunned silence. Klexron gave her everything she asked. For frequencies, positions, tactical plans, everything. Bell transmitted the information to Sullivan's fleet, set her explosive for a 5-minute delay, and walked off the bridge. Zix finished his drink in one gulp. With complete knowledge of our fleet positions, Sullivan regrouped her scattered forces and hit us where we were weakest. In 6 hours, she had turned a hopeless battle into a strategic victory. The massive veteran leaned back in his chair. Bell could have escaped with the information. Instead, she stayed behind to help evacuate wounded crew members from the flagship. Zixthack nodded when our security forces finally cornered her. Bell was in the medical bay, helping treat injured hegemony soldiers. She surrendered without resistance. The commander looked around at the packed cantina. That was the day we learned that humans do not just fight differently. On the 4th night, Commander Zix arrived at the cantina to find it transformed. Tables had been moved to create a small amphitheater with beings from dozens of worlds packed into every available space. News crews from 3 different networks had set up recording equipment. The story of the Terra campaign had become the most requested tale on Proxima Station. Zixthack made his way to his usual table, where the young cadets waited eagerly. Around them sat other veterans of the war, their scarred forms bearing witness to the truth of his words. The air hummed with anticipation. Tonight, Zixthack began, his voice carrying easily through the silent crowd. I will tell you how the Terra campaign ended and why that ending taught us the most important lesson of all. He accepted a drink from the serving droid and looked out over the assembled faces. After Wolf 359, both sides knew the war had to end. We had superior numbers and technology, but the humans had shown they could turn any advantage against us. Every victory cost us more than we could afford to lose. The 6-legged veteran from previous nights made his grinding sound. Tell them about the peace talks. Zixthack nodded slowly. The negotiations took place on a neutral space station in the Vega system. General Frank Davis represented the human military, while Ambassador Helen Price spoke for their civilian government. He paused to take a drink. I was part of Admiral Klexron's security detail. My job was to watch for human treachery, to protect our negotiators from whatever tricks the enemy might try. The tree-like cadet rustled its branches. Did the humans try to deceive you during the talks? That is what we expected, Zix replied. Instead, they did something far more unsettling. They told us the truth. The commander stood up and began pacing slowly behind his table. General Davis laid out the complete human military situation, every base, every ship, every weakness in their defenses. He gave us detailed reports on human casualties, resource shortages, and morale problems. One of the Cathari cadets looked confused. Why would they reveal their weaknesses? Because, Zixthack said, Davis wanted us to understand exactly what it would cost to continue the war. He showed us projections of human resistance for the next 10 years. The numbers were terrifying. The massive alien veteran leaned forward. Show them the casualty estimates. Sixth activated his holographic projector again. The air filled with columns of numbers and charts. According to Davis, complete conquest of human space would require 15 years and cost us 12 million soldiers. The humans would lose 40 million people, including most of their civilian population. The cantina was completely silent as being stared at the projected numbers, but here was the important part. Zigzag continued. Davis told us that humans would pay that price rather than surrender unconditionally. Every man, woman, and child would fight until none remained. He manipulated the display to show planetary maps. Ambassador Price explained their evacuation plans. If we conquered Earth, they would retreat to Mars. If we took Mars, they would move to the outer colonies. If we destroyed all their planets, they would live in spaceships and asteroid bases. The hologram showed human population scattering across the galaxy. Price estimated that scattered human resistance could continue for 300 years. Small groups of survivors carrying on the war with whatever weapons they could build or steal. Zigzag turned off the display and sat back down. That was when Admiral Klexron realized we had not been fighting a military campaign. We had been fighting an entire species that would rather die than submit. The young cadet sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications. The peace treaty was signed 3 days later. Zigzag continued. Both sides agreed to withdraw to pre-war boundaries. Humans would remain in their own systems. Hegemony forces would return to ours. He took another drink, his compound eyes distant with memory. But the real story began after the treaty was signed. That was when we learned the most important lesson about human nature. The serving droid brought fresh drinks for the table, but nobody touched them. 2 months after the war ended, the Zephyrian plague broke out in the outer colonies, a biological weapon left over from an ancient war. It killed any being with silicon-based blood. Half the species in the hegemony were vulnerable. Sixth voice grew softer. Our medical technology was useless against the plague. Within weeks, entire worlds were dying. Billions of beings faced extinction, and we had no way to stop it. The massive veteran made his grinding sound. Tell them who volunteered first. Colonel Tony Adams. Zigzag replied, the same human officer who had lost his entire family when we bombed New Geneva. He contacted our medical services and offered to help. The commander's forearms gestured as he described the events. Adams explained that human blood chemistry was completely different from ours. They could work in infected areas without protection. More importantly, their medical researchers had experience with similar biological agents. One of the Cathari cadets leaned forward. The humans helped their former enemies, not just Adams. Zigzag confirmed. Within days, thousands of human volunteers had arrived in hegemony space. Doctors, nurses, researchers, engineers, all offering to risk their lives to help beings who had been trying to kill them just months before. The cantina was so quiet that the air recycling system seemed loud. Captain Janet Moore designed the emergency medical stations that saved millions of lives. The same woman whose ship had been destroyed at Vega Prime, whose crew had died in the wreckage. Zigzag's voice filled with something that might have been wonder. Dr. Lisa Grant, the sergeant who had held off my battalion at New Ceres, worked 18-hour shifts treating plague victims. She contracted the disease herself while developing the cure. The six-legged veteran shifted in his chair. Grant survived. her immunity helped create the vaccine that ended the plague. Zixak nodded, but the point is not who survived. The point is that humans rushed to help without being asked, without expecting anything in return. He stood up again, his massive frame dominating the small stage area. That was when I finally understood what we had been fighting. Humans do not wage war because they hate their enemies. They wage war because they love something more than they fear death. Commander looked out over the packed cantina, and once the war was over, that same love extended to former enemies. Captain Steve Walsh, who I had captured on Kepler 442b, became my tactical advisor. The human I had considered my greatest enemy became my most trusted friend. Zixak's compound eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the crowd. 5 years after the war ended, I attended Walsh's wedding. He married a hegemony communications officer who had monitored his interrogations. Their children now serve in the Joint Defense Fleet. The tree cadet made its wind through leaves sound. How is such forgiveness possible? Because humans understand something that most species do not, Zixak replied. They know the difference between necessary enemies and eternal enemies. During the war, we were obstacles to their survival. After the war, we became potential allies in building something better. The commander began walking through the crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the cantina. Today, human and hegemony forces serve together throughout the galaxy. Admiral Kate Sullivan commands the Joint Fleet that protects both our territories. Colonel Amy Brooks trains mixed units in defensive tactics. He stopped near the young cadets' table. The most dangerous human warriors became our most valuable peacekeepers, not because they changed, but because we finally understood what motivated them. Six looked directly at each cadet in turn. You want to know the most chilling thing about human warfare? It is not their tactics or their weapons or their willingness to die. It is that they can fight you like demons one day and treat you like family the next. The cantina erupted in murmurs as beings discuss what they had heard. They do not fight because they hate you, Zixak continued, his voice rising above the noise. They fight because they love something more, and when the fighting is over, that same love can include former enemies. He returned to his table and finished his drink. Captain Walsh serves as my second in command now. Every day, work alongside the human who once tried to kill me. Every day he trusts me with his life, just as I trust him with mine. The old commander looked around at the assembled crowd one final time. That is why you never underestimate humanity. Not because they will destroy you, but because they might choose to save you instead, and that choice, young officers, will be based on principles you may not understand but must learn to respect. Six stood to leave, then paused. The Terra campaign ended 20 years ago. Today, human hegemony cooperation has created the most peaceful period in galactic history. We learned to fight alongside beings who had once been our deadliest enemies. He looked back at the young cadets. Remember this when you face impossible situations in your own careers. Sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but discovering you never needed to be enemies at all. With that, Commander, Zix walked away, leaving behind a cantina full of beings contemplating the true meaning of strength, honor, and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest times of war.